In this video, we're going to look at how to use R to perform some of the things that we saw in Module 6. So right now I've got RStudio open, but before that, what you're going to want to make sure you do is off of Canvas, you've downloaded 3 files. The first one is the BRFSS data, so that's the data from the survey. The code book, and you've actually seen this code book before in Module 4, and then the Module 6 R script. All right, so the first one here, notice this is a CSV. We could double click on this data and open it in Excel, but this is a pretty big data set, and so I actually don't want to open it in Excel to start out with. What we're going to do is we're actually going to open it up, we're going to look at it in R, and then we're actually going to make the data set a little bit smaller and more manageable. The code book, which you've seen before, I'm going to go ahead and open it again. We're going to want to keep this handy because the code book is going to help us as we're looking at this data set to understand what the different variables are. And then finally, we've got the Module 6 R script. So what I'm going to do to start out with, I'm just going to double click this. It's going to open up in RStudio. You're going to notice there's a lot of stuff going on here, but don't worry too much. We're going to go through this line by line and talk about what's happening here. And what you're going to be able to do is when you go to start making things in R, you're going to be able to take this R script and kind of edit it to do what you need it to do. So just as a reminder, it's been a little bit since we've looked at RStudio, so let's just remind ourselves what some of these different windows are. So this first window right here, what it is this is where we're going to have our script up. In other words, this is our file that we're going to work on, we're going to save things in. As we run things in our file, they're going to pop up down here in the console. And so this is where we're going to see our different pieces of output show. Here we've got our global environment. So as we create different things and we read data in, we're actually going to see that pop up in this window. And then finally down here, this fourth window, what we've got here is this is where when we make different plots, they're going to appear here. We could look up different help functions to help us look up different things. All kinds of good stuff happens down here in this fourth window. All right, looking at our R script. So you'll notice the first thing I've got here are these couple lines of code here. And you'll notice I've started them out using that pound sign or that hashtag sign, whichever one you want to call it. As a reminder, in R, this is how we make comments. In other words, any line that starts with this symbol, what this is this is a line for the user. This is a line to help us remember, okay, this is what we're doing, this is why I wrote this line of code, and this is what it's going to do. So generally what I like to do is I like to start my files with something like this. So when I open up this file, I automatically know, okay, this is the Module 6 R code. I know automatically what's going on in this file and what we're going to do here. And so you'll notice the next one says read in and edit the data. So that's the very first thing that we are going to do. So what we need to start out with is what's called setting the working directory. And so this is going to be the folder where the data is stored on your computer. And so this is one of the reasons I had you all open up that folder, there at the very beginning. So let's do that. So here's that folder again. And so the first thing we're going to need to figure out is what is the file path to get to this folder. And so in a Windows-based machine, this is pretty easy. What we can do is we can click up here, and you'll notice it creates the file path for us. And so we can click on copy. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to come down here to where it says set working directory, and in between the quotations, you want to make sure you keep the quotations. I'm going to delete out what's there, and I'm going to paste my new file path. Now there is one thing that we need to change. Windows uses the backslash in their file paths, but R uses the forward. So everywhere we have a backslash, you're going to want to change that to a forward. Okay, and we're going to highlight this line and we're going to run it. Okay. And so now that we've ran this line of code, you see it pops down here in the console. This particular line of code doesn't really have any output in it. It's just telling R, hey, this is the folder we're going to work out of. Now we're actually going to read in the data. So if you'll remember, R has what we call functions. And so anytime you see a function, it's going to have the name of the function and then open and close parentheses behind it with some stuff in the middle. So the first function we're going to use is what is called the read.csv function. So if you're ever going to use a function and you're not sure what that function does, what you can do is you can type in a question mark read.csv. And so we could highlight this and run it. And notice over here in the help, I already had it up, but in yours, it'll automatically appear. And what this is this is a description of that function and all of the things that it can do. Now, as we go along here, I'm going to add in some more comments, and I really recommend you add these in on your computer as well, because then when you go back later on, you'll be like, oh yeah, that's what that line of code does. So here, what I'm just going to say is placing a question mark in front of a function name tells us what the function does. Okay, and so now we're actually going to use that function. So you'll see here I've got that function name again, I've got the open and then the close parentheses, and then I got some stuff in the middle. So what this is going to do is it's going to read a CSV. I'm going to give it the name of the CSV right here. And then I'm going to tell it header equals true. And the reason I'm doing this is located in the CSV, each of those columns have a name associated with them. And then I'm going to assign this to be the object BRFS data. So in other words, I'm reading the data set into R. So we're going to run this. It's going to take it a minute. It's a pretty big data set. And so you'll notice down here in the console, that line of code has run, but we don't have a new arrow. So we just kind of have to sit back and wait, and then once that new arrow appears, then we know that R is done. So notice it's popped up, so we know R is done. And we can also see up here in our global environment, we now have our data set. So the next thing we might want to do is to view that data set. So I'm going to run view and then BRFSS underscore data, because remember, that's the object we've created that holds all of our data. Now, one thing to remember here is don't forget that R is case sensitive. Okay, so keep that in mind as you type things. So I'm going to click on run here. You're going to notice a new window pops up, and this new window is actually going to have all of our data. And so scrolling through here, notice this data set has 4,367 436 observations and 275 columns. This is a pretty big data set. And we're going to work with this data set throughout the course to kind of help you get a handle on it. But often in the real world, if you're working with data anymore, you're going to be working with these nice big data sets. And they're not always going to be pretty, they might be messy. And so we're going to work on those things as we move through the course. All right, so we've looked at our data. Now, for your reports that you're going to be making, you don't need all of the data. Your data is just going to come from a single state from the year 2018. So what I'm going to do next is I'm going to show you, okay, how can we pull out the information from a single state and for the year 2018? So I'm going to do this for Kentucky. All right, so let's first go and look at our BRFS codebook that we had earlier. Let's see where my codebook is. Bringing it over. All right, so I know there's a variable in this codebook that tells me about state, and it's actually the very first one. So first thing I want you to notice is the codebook is written in terms of SAS variable name, and so you'll notice that it is called underscore state. Well, R won't let you have a variable that starts with an underscore, so R is actually going to place an X in front of that when it reads it in. So scrolling through here, notice if I'm interested in Kentucky, anytime I have that variable equal to 21, then I know that I have data from Kentucky. And again, this is from this code book. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to subset the data to just get the Kentucky data. All right, so I'm going to assign a new object called Kentucky data, and this is how I'm going to do this. So I've got BRFSS data. So this is my original data set I've just created. And then you'll notice I've got an open and close bracket. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to access certain parts of this data set. Now in general, and I'm going to make myself a little comment here, when you're accessing this data set, so if I had BRFS underscore data, how R thinks of this is it has the square brackets, comma, anything you put in front of the comma tells it what rows you would like to see from the data set, and anything after tells it which columns. So I only want the rows for which the variable state is equal to 21. So notice here in front of this comma, I've got BRFSS data, and then I've got this $X state. So let's actually see what this is doing. If I took this piece of code out by itself, and I'm just going to kind of type it up above, what this piece of code is going to do is it is just going to pull the values for x underscore state. So notice here, there's a whole bunch of these, but what has happened is this line of code, and we don't actually want to run it, so I'm just going to comment it out. What this does is this accesses the column for the variable x state. And I should be good here because remember that R is case sensitive. So when this variable is equal to 21, those are the rows that we want. So notice here I've got BRFS data x state equal to 21. So when you go to subset your data, you're only going to want, that number that corresponds to your state. And so I'm going to run this. And notice what's happened here. We have went down from 36 observations, and we are now down to 8,548. So we have made our data set a lot smaller already, but this data set has the years 2018 and 2019. So we just want 2018. And one way that we could see, hey, what are the years that are in this data set, is we could use what's called the table function. So now I'm going to do table, but the column that I'm now interested in is I year. You might say, well, how do you know that you're interested in I year? Well, again, I'm going to have to go back to that code book. So you're going to notice that I'm referencing the code book a lot here. So going back to my code book, what I'm going to do next is I'm going to be looking, okay, what is that variable that tells me about year? Okay, so you might have to go down for a while. We'll keep on scrolling. And eventually, if you keep on going, or I may have missed it actually, you'll find the variable I year, which stands for interview year. And so really all I want is I want the year 2018. Oh, here it is. So notice variable I year. All right, so looking at this table, notice my table pops up here. I've got 1,944 observations from 2019. Well, I'm not interested in those. I just want the 2018 one. So I'm basically going to do the same trick that I did before. And so this new object, I'm going to call it KY 2018 data. And now I'm going to take my Kentucky data, so my data that just has Kentucky, and now I'm just going to get the year 2018. All right, so notice here, I've got 3 different data sets. I've got my big data set, I've got my data set with just Kentucky, and now I've got my data set with 2018. So you can use this exact same method to parse your data down to where you only have the state that you're assigned as well as 2018. And you might say, well, this is great, but wouldn't it be nice if I could just save that data set so I just have this, this much smaller one that I have to deal with? And so that's what these next lines of code do. So this next line of code is actually going to save this new data set as a CSV on your computer. And so you'll notice here for each of the different lines, I've kind of made a comment as to what they do. So we're going to use the function that's called write.table. And we're going to take that object that we just created, and we're going to save it as Kentucky 2018 underscore data.csv. So let's run this. All right, so it's ran. And now if we pull up that folder that I had earlier, notice this new CSV appears. So now, from now on when we work, we don't have to worry about taking the big data set and parsing it down each time. We can just always access this Kentucky 2018 data CSV. All right, now that we've got our data set ready to work with, next thing we're going to do is we're going to look at creating frequency tables, bar charts, and pie charts from Module 6. So the very first thing we're going to do is look at how can we create those frequency tables. So remember, frequency tables are one of the things that we use to summarize categorical or qualitative data. So in order to do these, first thing I'm going to want to do is I'm going to want to identify, okay, what is a categorical variable that I'm interested in learning about? And so the first one that I'm going to look at here is the education level. So again, going back to my code book, All right, so here's my code book. And I already had you in Module 4, look at some of these different variables. And again, the one that I'm interested in right now is education. So I'm going to look at education level. And notice the education level is categorical. Here are the different values that this variable takes. And here what we've got is this is for the entire data set, but we're just going to want to do this for Kentucky in the year 2018. So I'm going to minimize this again. So I could just start out by making a table. And so notice what I've got here. I've got Kentucky 2018 data because that's my data set that I'm working with. And the variable that I'm interested in is EDUCA. So remember, if I have the name of the data set and a $sign, oops, and then the name of the variable, again remembering that R is case sensitive, what we can do is we can make a table of that variable. So what I'm going to do is just highlight this, run it, and notice here is a table, and that's all great, but if I look at this table, I might not know what 1, 2, and 3, and 4 stand for. I'd have to keep on going back to the code book. So we're going to slowly look at how we can make this better. Now another thing I can do, instead of just running this code, I can actually assign a object named education.freq. I run this, notice no table is outputted, but then if I just call the object, I get the table. So there's two different ways you could do that. Now, one thing that I might also be interested in is, are there any missing values for this variable? And you can run this line of code to do that. So we run this, and we actually see there are no missing values. So this checks to see if there are any missing values. Okay. So this is a frequency table. We also learned about relative frequency tables. So to get this, what I'm going to do is actually run that same piece of code we ran before, which is right here, but then I'm going to divide by the number of rows. And there's your relative frequency table. Now notice the relative frequency table, it's got a lot of digits. Maybe I don't want that many digits. So what we can do is we can set what are called some options to reduce the number of digits. And so you'll notice here we've reduced the number of digits in our relative frequency table. Maybe you want to create a table of odds. Now for this particular example, for this variable, odds don't really make sense, but for the sake of illustration, notice what we've done here. I've called the education relative frequency, which we just created, and then I'm going to divide it by 1 minus the relative frequencies, which give us the odds. And so now we have a table of the odds. I could also combine the frequency, relative frequency, and odds into a single table. And so what the cbind function does is it combines different columns, or it binds columns together. So it is going to bind together the frequency, relative frequency, and the odds. And so looking at it, notice we have all of those bound together now. All right, after we've got our frequency table, we might want to create a bar graph. So let's do that. So the function that creates bar graphs in R is just called bar plot. And the argument that you actually want to give it is that frequency table that we just created. So here's the bar plot. It's not terribly exciting. It's missing a lot of the things we would like. We'd like it to have a title. We might want some different colors. And if somebody's reading this, I really don't want the numbers 1 through 9 down there because that's not very informative. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add a title. And so to do that, we're going to add in the argument main equals. And you'll notice here now we have a nice title on our plot. I'd also like to add labels. Instead of having the numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, so on down here at the bottom, I'd actually like what those numbers represent. So you'll notice what I've got here is I've created a new object called ED levels. This symbol right here in R is the same thing as an equal sign, so I could change that over to equal, no problem. And then what this does, that little c, is it's going to combine all the things that I put inside the parentheses. So I want to make sure whatever order I have these numbers in, that's the same order that I want these labels in. So again, I'm going to go back to my code book. So here's my code book. And so notice that a value of 1 represents never attended school or only kindergarten. So I've called it kindergarten or less. Grade 1 through 9 elementary is number 2. So I've now put in elementary. And notice each of these are in quotations because they're what we call characters. And they're all separated by a comma. And so I've gone through and done this for each of the value labels in our code book. All right. And so then next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create this bar plot. But you'll notice now my bar plot, I've got a lot of stuff going on here. It makes it a little harder to read. So what you can do is after each comma, you can actually start a new line. And so let's do that. And so by separating this out, this makes this a little bit easier to read what's going on here. So for this bar plot, we're going to read the education frequency table. We're going to give it a title of Education Levels, BRFS Kentucky 2018. My X label is going to be Education Level. My Y label is going to be Count. And then for the names or the arguments, what I want down at the bottom are going to be these education levels I have up top. So let's run that. Oops. Notice here I forgot to run that top line of code, so that's why it had an error. So if we run that again, notice, okay, we've got our title, we've got our Y-axis labeled, our X-axis, but unfortunately, some of our labels didn't pop up at the bottom. Well, to fix that, you can actually just make this window bigger, and notice as you make it bigger, it's got more space, so it'll add those in. And so if you like this plot, and this is something that you want to add to like a document to save later, what you can then do is go up to this export button and click Save as Image. And then you can save that to your computer, and you've got that to put in your reports. Now you might not like the gray. You might say, well, that's a little drab. Well, we can add in one more argument. It's the COL argument, and we can make our bar plot blue. So notice now we have a nice blue bar plot. All right. I might also want to create a pie graph. And again, the pie graph is going to take advantage of that frequency table we built earlier. So I'm going to call the function pi. And again, pi makes a pie chart. Click run. And notice we get a not too exciting bar chart. So same thing. What we're going to do is we're going to want to jazz this up a little bit. We're going to change it and make it a little more readable. So if you're interested in the pi function, again, we can do $pi and run this. And you'll get all kinds of stuff here about what the pie chart can do. So the first thing I'm going to do is add a title. So notice now we've got a title. And just like we did with the bar plot, we're going to add in those education levels. Now we've got a little bit of a problem here. Notice that some of these are overlying each other. They don't look that great. So next thing I'm going to do is I'd like to add some percentages to these labels. And so to do this, we've got a couple lines of code that do this. But for your chart, you can pretty much do the same thing. You'll just want to change the variable names. So the first thing I've got here is I'm creating a variable. It's called %. And so all I'm going to do is I'm going to take those relative frequencies, which were in decimal point form, and change them over to percentages. So this is just changing the relative frequencies to percentages. All right, the next one, the ED levels. This is the same thing we did earlier. I just went to the code book and I saw what each of those levels represent. And then what this is going to do, these ED levels dot percent, is it's going to paste the ED level to the percent. So let's actually run these three. And let's just see what ED levels dot percent look like. So notice if we run this, okay, this doesn't look too bad. I got kindergarten or less 0, elementary 3, some high school 6. But really, I'd like this to look even better and have that percentage sign with them. So what this is going to do is add the percentages to those labels. So now if we look at, oops, missed the letter there. Let's run that again. If we now look at ED levels %, notice that percentage sign has been added on. So we're going to run our pie chart. Oh, it looks a little bit better. We still have that overlap issue, but we've added on the percentages. So maybe instead we want to sort this by frequency from smallest to largest. Well, to do that, what we can do is say, okay, education frequency sorted is going to be sort, and we're going to sort the education frequencies. So this one is going to sort by frequency. And then ED levels sorted. Now what I've got to do is once these are sorted by frequency, I can't use the same labels as before because the labels are going to be in a different order. So you'll notice I did the same thing I did up here, except I looked at what the sorted frequencies were. So for example, let's run this. And notice that number 1 is the first one. The 1 corresponded to kindergarten or less. 9 is the next, which was 15, which corresponded to refuse to participate. So now I've changed the second one to refuse, and so on. So now we create our pie chart. Oops, need to highlight everything here. And now it's sorted, but we still have that overlap issue. Another thing we might want to do is maybe we don't like these colors. Maybe I would prefer each of these to be a separate color. Well, to do that, what I can do is now say COL, just like we did with the bar chart, except now I'm going to say C, open and close parentheses, and inside of there I'm going to place 7 different colors that I like. So notice we've changed the colors. Now we still have that overlapping issue. To change the overlapping issue on a pie chart, what you could do is instead of sorting this by sort, you could just change this to be the order that you want. And so you could sort these in a way so that you wouldn't have the 2 smallest right next to each other to create that overlap. Now, there are lots of other things that you could do here as far as bar charts and pie charts. And the different variables that you're looking at with your individual data sets may come up with different issues. So this script right here is just enough to get you started and to get you playing around looking at different variables. And so you'll notice on the worksheet that you work on, I don't just want to see education. I want to see, whatever's going to help you answer your research question. And so for that reason, I don't know the different issues that are going to arise for you. So I really want to encourage you as you're working on the worksheet that goes with this module to ask lots of questions. If you've got some code that isn't running, feel free to post it to the discussion board and say, hey, I've tried running this. I can't figure out why it isn't working. Can you help me out? Do keep in mind R is case sensitive. That's usually one of the biggest problems I see is the case sensitive issue. And the other thing I really want to promote is make sure that you understand what this code is doing with this data set. And if you understand that, that's going to help you a lot when you go to work with your own.